The summer storm arrived without warning, and Caspian found himself drenched on a stranger's doorstep. His train ticket clutched uselessly in his trembling hand as lightning split the darkening sky. The door swung open to reveal a boy with eyes like amber, caught in firelight, and in that suspended moment between thunder and silence, Caspian forgot why he'd been running at all. "You look like you've seen a ghost," the boy said, his voice carrying the warm notes of someone who smiled often, and Caspian realized with startling clarity that he was about to see his life change forever. Quillan stepped back to let the drenched stranger inside, watching water drip from dark curls onto the weathered floorboards of his family's old Victorian home. There was something magnetic about the way this boy held himself, shoulders squared, despite the obvious vulnerability of his situation. Chin lifted as though daring the universe to throw one more thing at him. "I'm Quillan," he offered, grabbing a towel from the linen closet and holding it out like a peace offering, their fingers brushing in the exchange and sending an unexpected jolt through his system. "Caspian," came the reply, and Quillan watched him wrap the towel around his shoulders, noting the way his hands shook slightly, and the determined set of his jaw that suggested he was trying very hard not to appear as lost as he clearly felt. The storm outside intensified, rain hammering against the windows with such force that conversation seemed almost intrusive. But Quillan couldn't look away from this unexpected visitor who'd literally been delivered to his door by the tempest. "I was supposed to catch the last train to my aunt's place, but I got turned around in your town, and then the weather." Caspian trailed off, gesturing helplessly at the window, where sheets of rain obscured everything beyond the glass. Quillan's mother appeared in the hallway, her reading glasses perched on her nose and a concerned expression creasing her features as she took in the scene. "Goodness, you poor thing," she exclaimed, immediately shifting into the nurturing mode that had made her a beloved teacher in their small town. "You can't possibly go anywhere in this weather." She bustled around them, instructing Quillan to start water for tea while she fetched dry clothes. And within moments Caspian found himself swept up in the warm chaos of a household that seemed to run on kindness and instinct rather than careful planning. The guest room was small but cozy, with slanted ceilings that spoke of the house's age and a window seat overlooking what Quillan promised was usually a lovely garden. Caspian changed into borrowed clothes that hung slightly loose on his frame, the fabric soft from many washings and carrying the faint scent of lavender and something else he couldn't quite identify. When he emerged, Quillan was waiting in the hallway with 2 steaming mugs, that same easy smile playing at his lips, and Caspian felt something shift in his chest like a lock finally finding its key. They sat in Quillan's room, because the rest of the house was dark and his parents had already retired for the evening, trusting their son's judgment in a way that spoke of years of earned confidence. The space was unmistakably Quillan's territory, walls covered with concert posters and photographs, books stacked in precarious towers on every available surface, and a guitar propped in the corner that looked well loved and frequently played. Caspian perched on the edge of the bed, while Quillan folded himself into the window seat, and they talked with the kind of immediate intimacy that sometimes springs up between strangers who recognize something kindred in each other. "So what were you running from?" Quillan asked after an hour had passed, the question gentle but direct, and Caspian found himself answering with an honesty that surprised them both. He spoke of his father's rigid expectations, the suffocating weight of a future already planned out for him like a prison sentence, the desperate need to find space to simply breathe and figure out who he actually was beneath the layers of who everyone needed him to be. The words tumbled out faster and faster, years of pressure releasing like steam from a valve, and Quillan listened with the kind of focused attention that made Caspian feel truly seen for perhaps the first time in his life. "My parents think I'm going to take over the family business," Quillan confessed, when Caspian's words finally ran dry, his fingers tracing patterns on the fogged window glass. "Import-export, incredibly boring. Absolutely not what I want to do with my life." There was a wistfulness in his voice that resonated with Caspian's own trapped feeling. Though Quillan's cage seemed gilded with love rather than locked with expectation. I want to make music, travel, see things that aren't in this town where everyone knows everyone and nothing ever really changes, he continued. And Caspian recognized the yearning of someone who'd spent too long looking at horizons they weren't allowed to chase. The storm outside had settled into a steady rhythm, no longer violent but persistent, as though the weather itself had decided to give them this pocket of time outside normal rules. They traded stories like precious currency, each revelation met with understanding rather than judgment, building a foundation of trust with startling speed. Caspian learned that Quillan played in a local band that performed at the community center every other Friday, that he had a younger sister away at summer camp, that he'd once spent an entire night reading under the stars because he couldn't bear to go inside and break the spell. Quillan discovered that Caspian painted when he couldn't sleep, that he'd memorized entire passages of poetry to keep himself company during lonely nights, that beneath the polished exterior his parents had cultivated was someone wild and soft and desperately wanting to be known. Hours passed without notice, the night deepening around them until the storm finally exhausted itself into silence. Caspian should have felt tired. He'd been traveling since morning, but instead he felt electrified, every nerve ending aware of Quillan's presence across the room like a magnetic field he couldn't escape. There was something in the way Quillan looked at him, a directness that made Caspian's breath catch, as though Quillan was reading the truth of him in a language Caspian himself was still learning. "You can stay longer if you want," Quillan said suddenly, the words casual, but his eyes intense. "I mean, if your aunt won't mind, and if you're not in a rush, we could. You could stay a few days. Maybe." The invitation hung between them, weighted with possibility, and Caspian found himself nodding before his rational mind could intervene with all the reasons why that was complicated. "I'd like that," he admitted, the words feeling like jumping off a cliff, and the smile that broke across Quillan's face was worth any amount of uncertainty. They said goodnight reluctantly, Caspian returning to the guest room, where he lay awake for hours, replaying every moment of the evening, his heart racing with a feeling he couldn't quite name, but that felt suspiciously like recognition. Morning arrived with sunshine that seemed almost apologetic after the previous night's drama, light streaming through the guest room window and painting everything golden. Caspian woke to the smell of coffee and something baking, the sounds of a household in comfortable motion drifting up through the floorboards. He dressed in his own clothes, now dry and neatly folded on the chair, and made his way downstairs with butterflies rioting in his stomach at the prospect of seeing Quillan in daylight, wondering if last night's connection would survive the harsh illumination of morning. Quillan was at the kitchen table, his hair sleep-mussed, and a mug cradled between his palms, and when he looked up at Caspian's entrance, that same electric awareness sparked between them. "Morning," he said, and the simple word carried enough warmth to ease Caspian's anxieties. "Mom made cinnamon rolls because apparently feeding people is how she processes the existence of house guests." His tone was affectionate and exasperated in equal measure, and Caspian found himself relaxing into the easy domesticity of the scene, accepting a plate and settling into the chair beside Quillan, like he'd done it 1,000 times before. Quillan's mother, who insisted Caspian call her Margaret, chattered pleasantly about the storm damage around town. Nothing serious, just branches down and some flooded basements, while serving breakfast with the efficiency of someone who'd perfected the morning routine. She asked gentle questions about Caspian's plans that made it clear. Quillan had already mentioned the possibility of an extended visit, her expression open and welcoming in a way that made Caspian's chest tight with unexpected emotion. "Any friend of Quillan's is welcome here as long as they'd like to stay," she said firmly, meeting Caspian's eyes with maternal directness, and he found himself blinking back, grateful tears at this casual acceptance from a stranger. The day unfolded with the lazy pleasure of summer vacation, Quillan playing tour guide through their small town, with an enthusiasm that suggested he rarely got to show it off to someone new. They walked through the downtown area where shop owners knew Quillan by name and regarded Caspian with friendly curiosity, past the library where Quillan admitted to spending most of his free time, around the park where children splashed in puddles left by the storm. Everything was painted in that particular golden light of late June, and Caspian found himself falling a little bit in love with this place that felt suspended outside of time, where people smiled at strangers and nobody seemed to be in a particular hurry to get anywhere. They ended up at what Quillan called his spot, a clearing by the river where willows dipped their branches into the current, and the sound of water moving over rocks created a constant soothing melody. Quillan sprawled on the grass with the unconscious grace of someone completely comfortable in their body, and Caspian sat beside him, hyper-aware of the bare inches between them. "I come here when I need to think," Quillan explained, tilting his face toward the sun filtering through the leaves, "or when I need to not think, depending on the day." There was something peaceful about him in this setting, as though he belonged to this landscape in a way that couldn't be separated, and Caspian wanted to capture this moment somehow, preserve it like a photograph he could return to later. "Can I draw you?" The question escaped before Caspian could second-guess it, and Quillan's eyes opened to regard him with surprise, and something else, something that made Caspian's pulse quicken. "I don't have my supplies with me, but I could sketch, if you don't mind," he added quickly, suddenly uncertain. But Quillan was already nodding, resettling himself with an unconscious elegance that suggested this wasn't vanity, but genuine interest. Caspian borrowed a pen from Quillan's pocket and began sketching on the back of a receipt, his hand moving with confidence as he translated what he saw into line and shadow, trying to capture not just Quillan's features, but the quality of light around him, the way he seemed to glow from within. Quillan watched him work with an intensity that should have been unnerving, but instead felt like being truly witnessed. "You're really talented," he said quietly, when Caspian finally held up the finished sketch, his voice carrying a note of wonder that made Caspian flush with pleasure. "I mean it, Caspian. You see things differently, don't you?" It wasn't really a question, more an observation, and Caspian found himself nodding, acknowledging this truth about himself that he rarely spoke aloud. They sat there for a long moment, the sketch passing between their hands, and when their fingers touched, neither of them pulled away immediately. Letting the contact linger like a question neither was quite ready to ask. The afternoon stretched into evening, and they returned to Quillan's house for dinner, where his father joined them, a quiet man with kind eyes who asked thoughtful questions and seemed genuinely interested in Caspian's answers. The meal was chaotic and warm, conversation flowing easily, laughter punctuating stories about town gossip and family memories. Caspian felt himself relaxing in increments, the constant vigilance he usually maintained around authority figures, gradually dissolving in the face of such uncomplicated acceptance. When Quillan's father mentioned that they'd be happy to have Caspian stay the week if he wanted, the offer casual but sincere, Caspian heard himself accepting before he'd fully processed the implications of spending that much time in close quarters with someone who already occupied far too much space in his thoughts. That night they ended up on the back porch, the summer air warm and thick, with the smell of night-blooming jasmine from Margaret's garden. Quillan had brought his guitar, fingers moving over the strings with practiced ease, playing melodies that seemed to pour directly from his heart without needing to pass through conscious thought. Caspian listened with his eyes closed, letting the music wash over him, and when Quillan's voice joined the guitar rough and honest and heartbreakingly beautiful, he felt something crack open inside his chest. "I've never played for anyone like this," Quillan admitted when the song ended, his voice soft in the darkness. "Usually there's a whole band, or it's a performance, but this is just me. I like just you," Caspian said, the words emerging before his brain could censor them, and the silence that followed felt pregnant with meaning. Quillan set the guitar aside carefully, and when he turned to look at Caspian, there was something vulnerable in his expression, all his usual confidence stripped away to reveal the tender person underneath. "Caspian," he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle with what he wanted to say. And Caspian found himself leaning forward, unconsciously, drawn by invisible threads he couldn't name. "I know we just met, and this is probably crazy, but I feel like I've been waiting for you," Quillan finally managed, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Like everything before this was just marking time, until you showed up on my doorstep in that storm." Caspian's heart was hammering so hard he was sure Quillan must be able to hear it. His whole body trembling with the weight of this moment, balanced on a knife's edge. "I feel it too," he whispered, reaching out to touch Quillan's face with shaking fingers, tracing the line of his jaw with something like reverence. "I don't understand it, but I feel it too." Quillan turned his head to press a kiss to Caspian's palm. The gesture so tender, it made Caspian's eyes sting with unexpected tears. And then they were moving together like magnets finally allowed to meet, the space between them collapsing into nothing. Their first kiss was soft and questioning, lips meeting with gentle pressure, as though they were both afraid of breaking something precious. Quillan's hand came up to cup the back of Caspian's neck, fingers threading through his hair, and Caspian melted into the touch with a small sound of surrender. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Quillan rested his forehead against Caspian's, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "Is this okay?" Quillan asked, always checking, always making sure. And Caspian answered by kissing him again, harder this time, pouring all his desperate longing into the press of mouth against mouth. They stayed on that porch until the stars wheeled overhead and the moon climbed high, kissing with the clumsy passion of first discovery, learning each other through touch and taste. Caspian felt like he was burning alive from the inside out, every nerve ending singing with awareness of Quillan's body against his, the solid warmth of him, the way he kissed, like he was trying to memorize Caspian through touch alone. When they finally pulled apart, lips swollen and eyes dark with want, Quillan was grinning like he'd just discovered a secret the rest of the world didn't know. "Stay," he said again, more insistent this time. "Stay the whole summer if you can. I don't care if it's crazy. I just want more time with you." Caspian should have been thinking about consequences, about his family waiting for him, about all the reasons this was complicated, but looking at Quillan's face in the moonlight, seeing his own feelings reflected back with such naked honesty, he found he couldn't bring himself to care about any of it. "Okay," he agreed, sealing his fate with a single word. And when Quillan kissed him again in celebration, Caspian felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be for the first time in his entire life. The next few days passed in a haze of discovery that felt both urgent and endless. Each moment somehow both too fast and perfectly suspended in time. They spent hours in Quillan's room ostensibly doing normal things, listening to music, talking, reading, but everything was charged with new awareness, every accidental touch sparking like static electricity. Caspian found himself constantly aware of where Quillan was in space, his body oriented toward him like a compass finding north. And when he caught Quillan looking at him with that same intense focus, heat would rush through him in waves that left him dizzy. Margaret seemed to sense something had shifted between them, but said nothing, her knowing smiles warm rather than intrusive as she observed the way they orbited each other. Quillan's father was equally subtle, simply accepting Caspian's presence, as though it were completely natural to have a teenage boy they'd known for less than a week living in their home, indefinitely. Caspian called his aunt and explained the situation in vague terms. He'd met a friend. Would she mind if he stayed a bit longer? And she'd agreed with the kind of easy flexibility that came from having raised 4 children of her own. His parents were a different story, but he pushed thoughts of them away, unwilling to let reality intrude on this perfect bubble he and Quillan had created. They fell into routines that felt domestic in the best way. Quillan teaching Caspian to play basic chords on the guitar, while Caspian showed Quillan watercolor techniques using supplies Margaret had unearthed from some forgotten closet. They cooked together. Quillan's kitchen skills surprisingly competent as he walked Caspian through his favorite recipes, the two of them moving around each other with increasing synchronization. In the evenings, they'd escape to the porch or Quillan's room, and the kisses grew longer, more heated, hands beginning to wander with cautious curiosity as they explored the boundaries of this new territory they'd entered. One afternoon they lay tangled together on Quillan's bed, the summer heat making them languid and relaxed, Quillan's head resting on Caspian's chest as they listened to music through shared earbuds. Caspian's fingers traced idle patterns on Quillan's shoulder, feeling the warmth of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt, and he felt drunk on contentment, on the simple pleasure of being close to someone who wanted him just as much as he wanted them. "I've never felt like this before," Quillan murmured, his voice vibrating against Caspian's ribs. "This happy, like everything finally makes sense." Caspian tightened his arms around him, pressing a kiss to the top of his head, breathing in the scent of his shampoo mixed with summer sun. "Me neither," Caspian admitted, marveling at how easy it was to be honest with Quillan, how he could say things he'd never dared voice before. "My whole life has been about meeting expectations, being who everyone needed me to be, and with you I can just be." It was a profound relief, being seen and accepted completely, and he felt tears prick his eyes at the sweetness of it. Quillan shifted so he could look up at Caspian's face, his expression tender and fierce in equal measure, and when he kissed him, it was slow and deep, a promise without words that Caspian felt echo through his entire body. They were interrupted by Margaret calling them for dinner, and they separated reluctantly. Quillan's cheeks flushed, and his lips kissed swollen in a way that made Caspian want to pull him back and never let go. At the table they tried to act normal, but Margaret's knowing smile suggested they weren't fooling anyone, and when Quillan's foot hooked around Caspian's ankle under the table, he had to bite his lip to keep from grinning like an idiot. After dinner, they escaped to the river again, to their spot, where the willows created a private world. And there under the canopy of leaves they kissed until they were both breathless, Quillan pressing Caspian back against the grass with a hunger that made Caspian's blood sing. "Is this too fast?" Quillan asked, even as his hands slipped under the hem of Caspian's shirt, fingers splaying across his stomach and making him gasp at the contact. "I don't want to rush you, but God, Caspian, I want you so much it scares me." His honesty was devastating, and Caspian pulled him down for another kiss, trying to communicate through touch everything he couldn't put into words. They'd known each other less than a week, but it felt like a lifetime, like they'd been building toward this moment through all the years before they met. And Caspian found he wasn't scared at all, just eager and desperate and absolutely certain. "Not too fast," he managed to say between kisses, his own hands exploring the planes of Quillan's back, feeling the muscles shift under skin. "This is exactly right." And it was everything about being with Quillan felt right in a way nothing else in Caspian's life ever had. They stayed by the river until the sun set, touching and kissing and whispering confessions into the gathering dark, and when they finally stumbled back to the house, they were both giddy and rumpled, caught in the grip of something bigger than both of them. The days continued to unfold in this pattern, each one bleeding into the next in a blur of happiness so acute it almost hurt. Quillan introduced Caspian to his bandmates, a collection of equally music-obsessed teenagers who welcomed Caspian into their fold with easy camaraderie. They'd practice in someone's garage and Caspian would watch, mesmerized by the way Quillan transformed on stage, all his quiet intensity channeled into performance. During breaks, Quillan would seek him out, needing to touch him like he was making sure Caspian was real, and the casual affection between them was remarked upon by exactly no one, everyone simply accepting their connection as obvious and natural. But in quiet moments, usually late at night, when they were alone, The reality of their situation would creep in around the edges of their happiness. They were both boys in love, in a world that didn't always accept such things, both from families they weren't sure would understand. Quillan's family seemed open and accepting, but he'd never tested them on this specifically, and Caspian's parents. He couldn't even imagine how that conversation would go. "We'll figure it out," Quillan would insist whenever Caspian's anxiety spiraled, holding him close and speaking with conviction that Caspian wished he could share. "Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." And in those moments, wrapped in Quillan's arms, Caspian could almost believe him. A week became 2, and Caspian knew he couldn't avoid reality forever, but he was determined to hold on to this perfect bubble as long as possible. They made love for the first time on a night when Quillan's parents were out at some community event. The house empty and quiet around them. It was tender and awkward, and absolutely perfect, both of them learning each other's bodies with reverent attention, taking their time despite the urgency singing through their blood. Afterward they lay tangled together, skin to skin, hearts gradually slowing from their racing pace, and Caspian felt transformed, like he'd shed an old self and emerged as someone new and infinitely more alive. "I love you," Quillan said into the silence. The words simple, but weighted with everything they'd built between them. And Caspian's breath caught in his throat. "I know it's soon, and maybe you're not ready to say it back, but I needed you to know." His voice was steady, but Caspian could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, could sense the vulnerability in the admission. Caspian turned in his arms, cupping Quillan's face between his palms, looking into those amber eyes that had first captivated him, and felt his own heart swell with certainty. "I love you too," he said, watching joy break across Quillan's face like sunrise. "I think I started falling the moment you opened your door in the storm." They kissed then, soft and deep, sealing this newest promise between them, and Caspian felt like he was glowing from the inside out. They stayed in bed for hours, talking and touching and simply existing together, and when sleep finally claimed them, they were still wrapped around each other, as though even in unconsciousness they couldn't bear to be apart. The next morning arrived with the harsh intrusion of Caspian's phone ringing insistently. His aunt's number flashed on the screen, and with growing dread, Caspian answered to find his mother on the line, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. His aunt had apparently mentioned where he was actually staying, and his mother had called demanding explanations, wanting to know why her son was wasting time with strangers instead of preparing for his future. The conversation was brutal, his mother's disappointment a tangible force even through the phone line, and when Caspian finally hung up, he was shaking with a mixture of anger and grief. The perfect bubble well and truly burst. Quillan found him on the back porch, curled into himself and trying not to cry, and immediately wrapped around him like a shield. "What happened?" he asked gently, and Caspian found himself spilling everything: his family's expectations, the life already planned out for him, the impossibility of ever being truly himself with people who saw him only as an extension of their own ambitions. "They're going to make me come home," he whispered, the words tasting like defeat. "My mother said I have 1 week, and then she's coming to get me herself." The thought of leaving this place, leaving Quillan, felt like having his heart carved out, and the tears he'd been holding back finally spilled over. "Then we have a week," Quillan said with fierce determination, tilting Caspian's face up to meet his eyes. "A week to make so many memories that you'll carry them forever, and then we'll figure out how to see each other after, because this," he gestured between them, "this is real, Caspian. This matters, and I'm not giving up on it just because your parents don't understand." His certainty was a balm on Caspian's wounded heart, and Caspian found himself nodding, clinging to Quillan like an anchor in a storm. They would make the most of the time they had, and then they'd find a way forward. Together, the final week was bittersweet, every moment precious because they knew it was limited. They filled their days with experiences, determined to pack a lifetime into a handful of days. Quillan took Caspian to every meaningful place in town, sharing his history and creating new memories to layer over old ones. They went to the community center to watch Quillan's band play a proper show, and Caspian felt his heart swell with pride watching Quillan on the stage, pouring his soul into every note. Afterward, flushed with adrenaline and success, Quillan had pulled Caspian into a storage closet and kissed him breathless, both of them grinning like fools at the romance of it. They spent long afternoons at the river, sometimes swimming in the cool water to escape the summer heat, sometimes just lying in the grass and talking for hours. Quillan shared his dreams of making it as a musician, of touring the world and writing songs that mattered, and Caspian talked about wanting to study art formally, to learn how to capture not just what he saw, but what he felt. They built futures together in those conversations, imagining a life where they didn't have to hide who they were or who they loved, where their families supported rather than constrained them. It felt like building castles in the air, but the dreaming was sweet nonetheless. The nights were theirs entirely, Quillan's parents granting them privacy with the kind of trust that spoke volumes. They made love with increasing confidence, learning what made the other gasp and moan, taking pleasure in giving pleasure. But it wasn't just physical, they'd talk for hours afterward, sharing their deepest fears and most tender hopes, building an intimacy that went far beyond the joining of bodies. Caspian felt known in a way he'd never experienced, every part of him accepted and cherished, and he tried to give that same gift back to Quillan, showing him through touch and words how completely he was loved. One evening, Margaret asked them both to sit down, her expression serious enough that Caspian's stomach dropped with worry. But instead of disappointment or anger, she spoke with compassionate understanding that made Caspian's throat tight with emotion. "I can see that you two care for each other very much," she began, looking between them with maternal directness. "And I want you to know that love is always something to be celebrated, regardless of the form it takes." Quillan's hand found Caspian's, squeezing tight, and Caspian felt tears prick his eyes at this unexpected acceptance. She went on to talk about the challenges they'd face, the importance of having support systems, offering herself as someone they could turn to if they needed an ally in parental conversations. It was more than Caspian had dared hope for, and when Quillan's father added his own quiet agreement, nodding sagely and mentioning a cousin who'd faced similar situations, Caspian felt something hard and tight in his chest finally loosen. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice rough with emotion, and Margaret pulled him into a hug that felt like being seen and accepted in the most fundamental way. That night, lying in Quillan's arms, Caspian felt a renewed determination. If Quillan's parents could understand and accept them, maybe there was hope that his own family might eventually come around, even if it took time. But that hope was tested when his mother arrived 2 days before the promised week was up, clearly unwilling to wait any longer to reclaim her wayward son. She pulled up in her sleek car, looking out of place on the small-town street, her expression set in lines of disapproval that Caspian recognized all too well. The confrontation was inevitable, and Caspian faced it with Quillan at his side, their fingers laced together in a show of unity that made his mother's eyes narrow with suspicion. She demanded he pack his things immediately, that they needed to leave right away. But Caspian found a core of steel in himself he hadn't known existed. "No," he said. The word simple, but revolutionary. "I'm not leaving yet. You said I had a week, and I'm taking the full week." His mother's face went through several shades of red, arguments clearly forming, but before she could launch into a tirade, Margaret peered with refreshments and an invitation to come inside and discuss things civilly. It was a masterstroke of social maneuvering, making it impossible for his mother to refuse without appearing rude. And Caspian watched with amazement as Margaret gently but firmly took control of the situation. Inside, over tea and cookies that his mother picked at with obvious discomfort, the conversation was stilted and tense. His mother kept making pointed comments about responsibility and maturity, about how Caspian was throwing away opportunities with his impulsive behavior. But Margaret countered each criticism with gentle redirection, speaking about the importance of young people finding themselves, of allowing children to make their own choices even when parents disagreed. Quillan's father added his own perspective, talking about his own journey of disappointing his parents, before eventually finding a path they could respect. And slowly, incrementally, Caspian watched his mother's rigid certainty begin to crack. The breakthrough came when his mother finally asked directly what was going on, why Caspian was so determined to stay in this nowhere town with people he barely knew. And Caspian, gathering every ounce of courage he possessed, decided to tell her the truth. "Because I'm in love," he said, his voice steady, despite his racing heart. And he felt Quillan tense beside him. "I'm in love with Quillan, and these past weeks have been the happiest of my entire life." The silence that followed was deafening, his mother's face going through a complicated series of expressions, while Margaret and her husband sat calmly, presenting a united front of acceptance. "You're too young to know what love is," his mother finally said, but her voice lacked its usual conviction, uncertainty creeping in at the edges. "And this, Caspian, this isn't what we planned for you." The word "this" hung in the air, loaded with all the implications she wasn't saying directly, and Caspian felt anger surge through his fear. "When have you ever asked me what I planned for myself?" He shot back, years of repressed frustration finally finding voice. "You've spent my whole life telling me who to be, what to want, how to live, and you've never once asked me if that's what I actually wanted." The argument that followed was explosive, his mother's carefully maintained composure finally cracking as she voiced fears and prejudices that Caspian had always suspected but never heard spoken aloud. She talked about protecting him, about how difficult life would be if he chose this path, about reputation and family expectations, and a dozen other concerns that all boiled down to her discomfort with who her son actually was. Quillan stayed quiet through most of it, his presence a steady anchor, but when Caspian's mother made a particularly cutting remark about phase and confusion, he finally spoke up. "With respect, Mrs. Ashford," Quillan said, his voice calm but firm, "your son isn't confused. He's brave enough to be honest about who he is, which is more than a lot of people ever manage." He looked at Caspian with such open affection that there could be no doubt about his feelings, and continued, "And I know we're young, and maybe this won't last forever, but what we have is real, and it's important, and it deserves to be taken seriously." His words were simple, but powerful, and Caspian felt his heart swell with love for this boy, who was willing to stand up to disapproving parents for him. The conversation went in circles for what felt like hours, Caspian's mother alternating between anger and what might have been fear, Margaret and her husband providing steady, compassionate counter-arguments to each objection. Finally, exhausted and emotionally wrung out, a compromise was reached. Caspian would finish out the week as originally promised, but then he would return home. However, his mother agreed to actually talk with him about his future, to listen to what he wanted instead of simply imposing her vision. It wasn't everything Caspian wanted, but it was more than he'd expected, and he took it as a small victory. After his mother left, promising to return at the end of the week, Caspian collapsed into Quillan's arms, shaking with reaction to the confrontation. "You were amazing," Quillan murmured, holding him close and pressing kisses to his hair. "So brave and strong, and I'm so proud of you." Caspian clung to him, drawing strength from his presence, and felt something shift inside him. He'd stood up to his mother, had claimed his truth out loud, and while the road ahead was uncertain, he felt more himself than he ever had before. The final days took on a desperate edge, both of them hyper-aware of the time ticking away. They talked about logistics, how they'd stay in touch, when they might see each other again, making plans that felt both hopeful and impossibly fragile. Quillan promised to visit during fall break, and Caspian vowed to find a way back as soon as he could. But they both knew that maintaining a long-distance relationship at their age would be challenging. Still, they were determined to try. The connection between them too precious to abandon without a fight. On Caspian's last night, they returned to their spot by the river one final time. The summer air was thick and sweet, fireflies dancing among the willow branches, and they lay in the grass holding each other as the stars emerged overhead. "Promise me something," Quillan said softly, his fingers tracing patterns on Caspian's arm. "Promise me you won't let them make you small, that you'll keep fighting for who you are, even when it's hard." Caspian turned to look at him, seeing the love and concern in those amber eyes, and nodded solemnly. "I promise," he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. "And you promise me you'll keep making music, keep chasing your dreams. Don't let this town keep you small either." They sealed their promises with kisses that tasted of salt and summer and bittersweet goodbye, both of them trying to memorize the feel of the other, to carry this moment forward into an uncertain future. They made love there under the stars, tender and desperate, pouring everything they felt into the joining of their bodies, and afterward they lay tangled together, neither willing to acknowledge that morning was coming. When dawn finally broke, they walked back to the house hand in hand, both red-eyed and exhausted, but determinedly not crying. Margaret had made an elaborate breakfast, clearly her way of coping with the impending goodbye, and they all ate together with forced cheer, pretending this was just another morning. Caspian's mother arrived precisely on time, and there was an awkward moment where she had to witness her son and Quillan saying goodbye, unable to deny the obvious love between them. To her credit, she didn't make a scene, just waited by the car with thinly veiled impatience while they had their final moments. "This isn't forever," Quillan said fiercely, holding Caspian's face between his palms. "We'll see each other again. I refuse to believe otherwise." Caspian nodded, not trusting his voice, and kissed him one last time, trying to put everything he felt into the press of lips. When they finally pulled apart, both had tears streaming down their faces, and Margaret was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. The goodbyes to Quillan's parents were emotional as well. Margaret hugging Caspian tightly and making him promise to call, to stay in touch, offering her support in whatever way he needed. The drive home was silent and tense, Caspian staring out the window as the miles accumulated between him and everything he'd just left behind. His mother made a few attempts at conversation but seemed to recognize that he needed space to process. But to her credit, she didn't interrupt, just nodded for him to continue. What followed was a remarkable conversation about how both families could support their sons' relationship while also ensuring they each pursued their own educations and dreams. By the end of the evening, they'd made plans for regular visits, discussed the possibility of the boys attending universities near each other, and most importantly, both sets of parents had explicitly stated their support for the relationship. Caspian's mother was still clearly struggling, but she looked her son in the eye and said, "I love you, and I'm trying to understand. That's all I can promise right now, but I'm trying." It was enough, more than enough, and Caspian felt tears slip down his cheeks as he thanked her, feeling a weight he'd carried for months finally begin to lift. That night, after Quillan's family had left for their hotel and the house was quiet, Caspian lay in bed marveling at how much had changed. 6 months ago he'd been running from his life, desperate to escape expectations that felt like chains. Then he'd met Quillan, and everything had shifted, reoriented around this person who'd seen him and loved him exactly as he was. They'd fought against prejudice and fear, and the easy path of hiding who they weren't somehow. Miraculously, they were winning. It wasn't over. He knew that. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt and difficulty, but they had their family's support now, however imperfect, and they had each other. The rest of senior year passed in a blur of college applications and planning. Caspian and Quillan both applied to schools in the same city, carefully not making their plans dependent on each other but hoping that proximity would make their relationship easier to maintain. They visited each other as often as they could manage, their families facilitating rather than hindering now, and each reunion felt like coming home. They were still young, still figuring out who they were, but they were doing it together, and that made all the difference. Spring brought acceptance letters and new anxiety as they navigated choosing schools. Both got into their first choices. Universities close enough that they could see each other regularly, but far enough that they'd each have their own experiences. It felt like the perfect balance, and when they broke the news to their families at a joint dinner, the celebration was genuine and warm. Caspian's mother even pulled Quillan aside later and apologized for how she'd initially reacted, admitting that getting to know him had opened her eyes in ways she hadn't expected. Quillan, ever gracious, thanked her and told her what it meant to have her support. Graduation came with all its bittersweet ceremony, and afterward the families joined together for a combined celebration. There were speeches and toasts. Caspian's father, getting emotional in a way no one had quite expected as he talked about being proud of his son's courage. Margaret gave them both journals, encouraging them to document their journey, and Quillan's father presented them with matching bracelets, simple leather bands with a small inscription. Together. It was corny and perfect, and both boys wore them constantly, a tangible reminder of everything they'd fought for and won. That summer they spent together in Quillan's town, Caspian staying with his family like he had that first magical summer a year ago. But this time there was no hiding, no fear of discovery. They were simply two boys in love, accepted by their families and community, free to be themselves without apology. They made new memories to layer over the old ones, returning to their spot by the river and marveling at how much had changed. A year ago I was terrified, Caspian admitted as they lay in the grass, Quillan's head on his chest. Terrified of losing you, of my family rejecting me, of having to choose between love and safety. And now? Quillan asked, tilting his head to look up at him with those amber eyes that still made Caspian's heart skip. Now I'm just excited, Caspian said honestly. Excited for university, for our future, for everything we're going to do together. I'm not scared anymore. It was true. The fear that had dogged him for so long had finally released its grip, replaced by hope and anticipation. They still faced challenges, still lived in a world that wasn't always accepting, but they faced it together, with the support of families who loved them. And that, Caspian had learned, made all the difference in the world. As summer drew to a close and Movin' Day approached, they packed their things with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was the beginning of their adult lives, the start of the independence they'd dreamed about. But it was also another kind of beginning, not just of their individual journeys, but of the life they were building together. On their last night before heading to university, they returned one final time to the river, to the place where they'd first really talked, where they'd first kissed, where they'd made promises they'd somehow managed to keep. "Thank you," Quillan said into the gathering dusk. And when Caspian looked at him questioningly, he elaborated, "For showing up that night in the storm, for being brave enough to be yourself, for choosing me, choosing us, even when it was hard." His voice was thick with emotion, and Caspian pulled him close, pressing a kiss to his temple. "I'd choose you in every universe," Caspian replied softly, the words sounding like a vow. "In every lifetime, through every storm, you're it for me. You always will be." They kissed as the stars emerged overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their beginning, now watching over their transition into a new chapter. The future stretched out before them, uncertain but filled with possibility, and they faced it hand in hand, together, exactly as they'd promised. Their family's acceptance wasn't perfect, nothing ever was, but it was real and growing stronger, built on love and effort, and the gradual dismantling of prejudice. They were proof that change was possible, that love could triumph over fear, that speaking your truth could transform not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. As they walked back to the house for the last time, Quillan's hand warm in his, Caspian felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the storm that had brought him here, for every moment of courage it had taken to get to this point, for the boy beside him who'd become his whole world. Tomorrow they'd leave for university, beginning new adventures, while staying anchored to each other. But tonight they had this, the quiet comfort of being together, accepted and loved, exactly as they were. And really, Caspian thought, as they climbed the porch steps, what more could anyone ask for than that?